Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered and contribute to the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh. I'm coming to you from winter time in Auckland in New Zealand.
I'm Zack Semke. I'm coming to you from summertime in Sunnyvale, California. I'm visiting family.
And we've also got Mary on the show with us again today. How are you doing, Mary? Where are you from?
I am still and perpetually in Larkspur, California.
We'll get you somewhere else one day. Well, it's great to have you back on the show again, Mary. We've got our fourth and final Encore episodes for this time round. We're going to go back to episode 29. And I kind of stand by what I said a couple of weeks ago that I was used to not be a real fan of going back and hearing another episode, but I've actually listened to this episode 3 times now, and every time I get something new out of it. So I'm really pleased that Zack, you decided to have some of these Encore episodes and bring back some of the favorites. Yeah, before we get into that, let's thank our sponsors.
Absolutely. Our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsor is SIGA, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So a big thanks to all those supporters.
Mary, do you want to reintroduce us to our guests, Nina and Gaby?
Sure. So Nina Sharifi is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at Syracuse University. And Gaby Brainard is a Passive House consultant, architect, and an associate professor at Pratt Institute. And together they're working on a retrofit guide that's going to be super exciting when it comes out, to provide technical guidance and best practices for architects for mostly for the building types that are in the Northeast, a little bit in the Midwest, in the cold climate regions. But they talk about so much more in this episode than their building retrofit guide, which they're still working on. It's not quite out yet, but yeah, it's a great episode.
It is indeed a great episode. So let's get into it. Here they are. This is the conversation that Mary and Ilka had earlier this year with Nina and Gaby.
Welcome to our first podcast, celebrating Passive House feminists. We have 2 very exciting guests for our first episode who are collaborating on a retrofit guide for common building typologies found in cold climates. Nina Sharifi is an assistant professor at Syracuse University's School of Architecture and the director of the Applied Sciences and Technology Research and Architecture Lab. Gabrielle Brainard is an architect, facade specialist, and educator. She consults on Passive House projects, conducts academic research, and teaches architecture and building science at Pratt Institute and the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, both of which are located in New York City. The Envelope Retrofit Guide that they are collaborating on will provide technical guidance to architects in the early stages of net zero retrofit projects. The guide focuses on the building envelope, a critical component of high-performance retrofits that is the primary responsibility of the architect. You'll hear much more about that later in the podcast. During our conversation, you will also hear reference to New York City's Local Law 97, known as the Climate Mobilization Act. Briefly, that act will set a carbon emissions budget starting in 2024 for all buildings that are at least 50,000 square feet. So it applies to both commercial and residential buildings. These carbon emissions caps will ratchet up after 2024 and become fairly stringent by 2030. In order to meet these caps, it is expected that a large number of buildings will have to undergo substantive retrofits. And that explains the need for a comprehensive guide to high-performance building retrofits.
Thanks, Mary, for the background information. So I'm very excited about this podcast, and I think we couldn't have asked for better guests. As Mary said, we're going to talk about the retrofit guide, but before Nina and Gaby talk about it, we will find out more about their backgrounds. Nina will talk about what architectural science is, something that I had never heard of before, and where they see architects' responsibilities and opportunities in an overlap of architecture, construction, and technologies. So here we go.
Nina, can you start with telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in design and construction?
Well, I think that starts back from when I was a child. I was the only girl of three kids, so there were two boys and there was me. And from the time that I was still in diapers, I think I was swinging a hammer, and I was the only child of my father's who was interested at any time at all in what he was doing. And he was an engineer, so he was always building things. So we were always, down in the basement or out in the yard constructing things. And so, I think that's where my curiosity about building and the way things go together really came from. And I think that, in a way, it's shaped the way that I think about design and the way that I think about not only how things go together and what they are, but why they work the way they do. And so to this day, I have a tendency to take things apart to understand how they work. And so that ultimately led me from Texas, where I began practicing architecture in my 20s. And I kind of cut my teeth on Texas contractors on really big projects when I was young. So I grew a thick skin relatively quickly, you could say. So I gained early experience back then on a range of projects. And there was one in particular that was a net zero energy design project. And so, for us, this was fairly radical, and it was about, can we make this affordable? Can we design with dignity? And it was kind of a new concept at the time. And so this is where I became interested also. And so in the technology, what we called the bells and whistles at the time, which is very telling because we thought of technology as being separate from the architecture. But in addition to the technology and the research on building systems, it's where I also became interested in kind of design, build, develop business models, because those kinds of cost efficiencies that you could realize in that project delivery while providing a kind of turnkey project, that was what enabled it. And so this idea that it could all be integrated and that there could be a kind of, a collaboration between contractor, designer, finance, the neighborhood organizations, etc. That really interested me. And that's ultimately what led me to attend grad school in the Northeast. And then eventually to do what I'm doing now, which is to teach and conduct research in these kinds of interdisciplinary modes, I suppose.
Great. And Gaby, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your pathway toward where you are now?
Sure. So I actually didn't have a lot of exposure to architecture when I was young. I went to college at Yale in New Haven, and I studied history. And I just was really fascinated by the urban environment and urbanism and the way that the city had developed. And I ended up writing my thesis about a street of row houses, and I was looking at them over 100 years and looking at how they had changed, but actually also how they hadn't changed. So the buildings were the same, but the types of people who were living in them were different. And so it was sort of encompassing, it's kind of like, history, urban studies encompassing things like economics, industrialization, social movements, gentrification, this whole kind of scope of history, but reflected in these like really particular structures. So I think it's kind of similar to Nina. Like I started out with this really holistic idea of architecture. And then interestingly, in my career, I've actually focused on technology and construction technology. Not totally sure how that came about, but, I think I was just really attracted to the physical aspect of building, and that was something that, ironically, I did go back to grad school for architecture. But I kind of felt like something was really missing from the curriculum. I was sort of like, even though I actually went back to Yale, and Yale is known for this building project and you build a house, with your colleagues, but I just kind of felt like I wasn't really understanding the nuts and bolts of the technical aspects of building. When I went into the work world, I tried to seek those experiences out. I eventually, moved to New York, and I spent a number of years at Shop Architects, and it was at a time when the office was really experimenting with getting further and further into the construction of buildings, and they were actually basically doing design to fabrication for curtain wall, for enclosure systems. So they were modeling parts, and they were constantly on the phone with the factory, which was in Indiana, talking about, well, how big should this hole be? And, what kind of screws are you going to use? So it was extremely technical, but also, it also kind of had that aspect of that more holistic aspect. That was, I think, a little bit of an unusual introduction to the practice of architecture. And I think that kind of stuck with me and maybe really fed my interest in terms of, what does it mean? What does it mean to deal with technology and deal with the nuts and bolts of making things?
It sounds really interesting. It's definitely a little bit more of an unusual way of practicing architecture, particularly because the boundaries between construction and architecture are kind of crossed or blurred because both parties had to engage into the prefabrication process, right? So how did you feel crossing the line into construction and most likely finding yourself as one of the very few women in the field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting because, there was a definite gender dynamic with interfacing with construction and contractors for sure. Like it was really rare to go to a factory and, you'd just be the only woman, but I actually felt ironically more comfortable and more respected in those environments than I did working with some of our clients. And I'm not really sure why that was, but I think that I think there's an aspect of empathy to it. Like if you're coming in, first of all, you're an architect, so you're not, you don't belong in the construction world for that reason. And then you're also a woman. So you're sort of like this really exotic, creature. And I think if you approach the situation with a lot of empathy and really a desire to learn about, there's a huge amount of information and knowledge exchange that happens when an architect is going into a factory of any sort, because there's so much that you don't know. I think that there was a real respect for my desire to understand and the technical aspects, which, was in contrast to some of my other experiences working with some of our developer clients who didn't seem to have a lot of respect for the technical expertise in the way the contractors did. And it felt like the gender dynamic there was much more challenging than it was on the job site. Different cultures, different contexts, we're talking about working with, a very particular building culture in New York City. And I'm sure if I was in a different firm working on different projects, that might have been a different situation.
So Nina, you know quite a bit about technical expertise as well. You have a PhD in architectural science, and I'm very curious about what exactly that is and what your work environment looks like.
So architectural sciences, I would say, as a field, is relatively young in its kind of course of being established. However, so 10 years ago or so, I would say there are very, very few programs that could be described in this way. But distinguishes itself from purely building sciences in a couple of ways. In that it is really about fundamentally rethinking systems and buildings, paradigms in the way that we build and the way that we use materials, and considering these things and reconfiguring their kind of interrelationships as a series of nested ecologies with interdependent variables. And so it's about really innovation through that lens and from that perspective. And so it's about really kind of radical change as opposed to incremental change, or designing with what we have now and what is kind of available now, and with less kind of focus on overall building performance in the kind of as is, and more focus on yes, we're doing it this way now, but how could we be doing all of this better throughout the entire kind of supply chain? And so Anna Dyson ran CASE, the Center for Architecture, Science, and Ecology at RPI at Rensselaer when I was there. And this was almost, 10 years ago now. She's now over at Yale running a brilliant program, I believe, jointly with the School of Forestry. But the premise of the program back then was about the built ecology and focusing on problem first, very rigorous design research that examined major issues around buildings and energy, environmental quality, the way we use materials, like I said, and reconfiguring between, us and the natural world. And so, there were systems like one that was called sewer, and they all had these really clever acronyms, right? So one that was called sewer, it was about taking, moisture out of the air, and it was about, collecting moisture from the air as a kind of integrated facade system. As for me, I was working on a body of research that was about tech transfer and applying some of the research methodologies and techniques from aeronautical engineering towards the design of new systems that improved the aerodynamic performance of buildings, both on the exterior. As we know with tall buildings, there's a great deal of work that goes into that. And then interiors, as far as ventilation systems, and how do we conceive of, natural ventilation or hybrid ventilation systems that in the future don't use any fan power, or that use, different kinds of techniques to facilitate better overall air quality without, the refrigerants and without the electricity or the energy use that we need today. So again, at an institutional level, I think the really major thing that I didn't see until I was kind of out of the weeds was that it was about kind of leveraging in-house expertise across all of these departments and disciplines. And this was, to me, one of the most extraordinary feats that Anna accomplished behind the scenes. And this takes years to create in an institution. And in that way, I think she was preparing all of us to go into an industry and a research community that was already kind of making that interdisciplinary progress. and was already kind of working in these teams, of biologists and architects in some cases, or, engineers and architects, certainly, right? And so as far as the architectural sciences went, there were actually quite a few women in that program, but the aeronautical engineering, I would say in the lab I was in, there were a few women, but there was also there was a latent culture, I guess you could say, of, a little bit of kind of that masculine energy that you see sometimes in engineering and physics in particular. And so, I did encounter a bit from some, I will say, not all, from some of the folks in there who expressed a certain hostility towards my being there. And so that was a little bit problematic. And there was a little bit of, attempts to undermine and, anything from casual kind of misogyny to expressly kind of undermining. And so, but it was, like I said, just a couple of individuals really, and a little bit of that kind of latent culture. But overall, I would say it was very positive, and it really prepared me to, go forth and do what Anna had done, and to continue that at another institution, or if I were to go into industry from there, I think I could have done the same thing as far as creating buy-in. And she used to call it convening the collective, bringing people together behind a kind of a series of goals, right? Around which we can all work and agree on a common goal and develop innovative methodologies to create innovative systems or innovative research. And so now I feel like it's a matter of applying that same kind of idea and bringing, we have a really high population of female students as well in our undergraduate and graduate programs here, which is great. And I very consciously, try to encourage them to at least think about, some of this more STEM-leaning research in architecture. So that's something that I've tried to carry on.
So you talked about some hostility while working in these groups. Do you feel like the work environment and the acceptance of each other improved the more you worked together, or did it just kind of stay the same?
I think it's really a question, too, of how you organize the way that you work together and how you maintain focus. And so if everything in that room is about, we're here together to achieve a certain goal, this isn't this, culture of individualism where we have one-upmanship and one person is doing this and one person is doing that. And there's this constant kind of comparison. And I realize that's a luxury that not everyone has. In terms of being able to construct, a lab or a group of people working together like that. And it's something that I really try to instill also in my undergraduate students, that this is very much a field in which your collaborative skills are going to get you a long way. And so this notion and this mindset of, me versus everybody else is actually quite damaging in the long term. And so I like to think about, and to focus really on the work and what we can do together to achieve it. So it's, much less for me and the best firms, some of the best offices I worked at, like Banish in Stuttgart or Lake Plato in San Antonio, they were all like this, where the boss would sit out with everybody else. It was like we all just have a desk in a room, and, it's this constant kind of collaborative atmosphere.
So speaking of collaboration, that's a perfect segue into how did you two decide to work together and why retrofits? I understand you're going to be working together on a book about retrofits, and can you talk about that?
Yeah. Nina and I met while we were both teaching at RPI. A couple of years ago. Neither of us are there currently, but we were both involved in the building science and architecture programs there, and we really found some common ground in our interests. And I think after that experience, I think we may have just maybe I just reached out and proposed that we, I knew that Nina was interested in research.
Then we started this conversation with NYSERDA. Right. Saul Brown came into the picture from Retrofit New York.
Mm-hmm.
And we started this kind of conversation, these series of talks, I think, about Gaby and I developed a kind of wish list, almost a kind of large proposal for, looking at the retrofit market in New York State and understanding, after understanding a bit about what Retrofit New York was trying to do with this energy sprung concept that was starting to happen over in the Netherlands, in which the previous year they had decided, okay, this might be like a really great approach for retrofits for New York buildings. So it was all about the skin, the building envelope, and it was about updating mechanicals and so forth. And so it was like, okay, well, we could adapt this to New York, but the climate is very different. We have, there are these certain discrepancies that we have with building types, and how could we start to drill into this problem? This is something that we'd be really interested in. And, fortunately, they kind of kept the conversation going with us. And we also started it up with AIA around that time, didn't we, Gaby?
Yeah, those two projects happened around the same time. So the book project that you mentioned is growing out of an AIA grant that we got from the Upjohn Initiative to basically produce a retrofit guide for architects. So, we observed that there is a fair bit of research on retrofits, but it tends to be kind of siloed and it's difficult to access. And, with the types of initiatives that, the Retrofit New York program is proposing, and then, later that summer, I think Local Law 97 in New York City was passed. And so we just saw this kind of wave of retrofits, and, many people in the industry are talking about this, that, the combination of policy and legislation is going to really catalyze a lot of retrofit projects, but there seems to be a real lack of guidance available for architects to actually take on those projects. And, anyone who's ever done a renovation knows they're complex, technically complex and logistically complex. So we got some seed funding from AIA to produce this guide, and we're hoping to make it into a resource. Maybe it's in book form, maybe it's something online. We're not totally sure yet, but we wanted to, I guess it would be a sort of technical guidance in early stages for architects who really want to see like the full range of retrofit options and materials and systems that they could use for a particular building type. So it ties back into that work we did with NYSERDA, which Nina mentioned, which involved working with a large database of data on residential buildings in New York State. And we kind of put on our architect historical hats and tried to develop building typologies based on construction, material, age, and size to sort of say, well, can we make some buckets that these buildings fit in? And then how many buildings of each type do we have? Which seems like an important thing to know if you're going to be retrofitting, tens of thousands of buildings. While there is a lot of research and guidance on retrofits, some of it's from DOE, some of it is from like Building Science Corporation. The Passive House community has done a lot of retrofits. 475 has published, some retrofit guides. But, we felt like this stuff was a bit fragmented and difficult to access if you weren't already kind of in the know. So we wanted to create a resource where it was, more tailored to someone just not really knowing much about the topic at all and having a really broad-based information to help them figure out which direction to go in.
Yeah, and being both of us we're both educators as well. And so I think we're both keenly aware of some of the differences in perspective, let's say, some of the tensions that might exist across, building science, architecture, construction, and engineering. And we want to make something that's really palatable, to be frank, for architects, and something that, includes things like, building science principles in a way that is digestible for architects and can be a kind of quick reference guide. And and I think the other insight that was allotted to both of us that we were both kind of observing was that there really isn't a presence of retrofit design or retrofit design considerations that is really appearing or predominating in a lot of the pedagogical theory and pedagogical models in architecture schools. And so there's a gap between the need that needs to be filled, between the kind of demands that there will be for these millions of properties that are going to, the magnitude of this problem is really, it's quite staggering. There are millions of properties that are going to need to be retrofit. And if architects are taking on this problem, and we believe that they should take on a leadership role in addressing this, because of the way that architects think, because of the kind of, at the very least, architects are trained to think in this integrated way. And so, if we are to take on this leadership role, then we have to cover this gap, as Gaby was saying, that we have in the guidance and in the resources that are available, and really have a strong position there. And I think it's an opportunity to claim a bit of that territory. I think is really important for people who have the training and experience that architects have.
Do you think that architects are going to be more willing to take on this leadership role the more knowledge they gain or have about construction technology?
Yeah, and it's a bit like running a Mercedes-Benz dealership, right? So nobody walks in the door unless they're planning to buy a Mercedes-Benz. So if someone's opening this book and intending to take on a retrofit project of some complexity, then it's very likely that they're interested in the topics and they're going to take this on in a way that is challenging. And so I think there's a bit of a backlash that we're sensing on the ground, so to speak, against this movement or this perception of the role of the architect as kind of being relegated to the sort of aesthetic consultant, and back towards this idea of, okay, well, how could architects reclaim the mantle of the master builder, right? What does that mean? What does that even mean, right? In the 21st century, in terms of systems and understanding of physics and the way that buildings respond to things like environmental forces and climate change.
Yeah, I think the retrofit is a very, if we imagine the scale and the type of projects that are hopefully going to be happening over the next 10 to 20 years, they're really engaging architects so much beyond, that aesthetic consultant role. And, I don't know if I can say I think the culture of schools has kind of not caught up with that yet, but just speaking personally, like, you're just so much more of a whole person using all parts of your brain when you're dealing with, logistics and construction and fabrication and energy performance and, various consultants and maybe, also historic preservation, heritage concerns. These projects are really complex. Any renovation is, but when you have some high level, energy goals, even more so, it's just kind of more satisfying to practice that way. For me personally, and, it wasn't actually with all my kind of background in the sort of world of design. It really wasn't until I got my Passive House certification that this whole world opened up to me that was really connecting design to all these other things like policy and performance and materials and systems and, fabrication in many cases, new materials. And it really just felt like a much more holistic way to practice. So I guess I would hope to encourage my students to know that is out there and they don't just have to, focus just on the aesthetics or even just focus on the things that their design educators told them were important. They can decide what they think is important and there might be a whole world out there of people who agree with them.
Yeah, and that there could be also a blurring of this line between technology and system and building and design and aesthetics. And I think, honestly, we're in an unprecedented time where there's the possibility for that to start to happen.
I think it's also kind of the idea of shifting the idea of design, that it's not just aesthetics. I mean, all of it is kind of solving a puzzle, and it goes down into parts, into the technology of everything. And that, in my opinion, is absolutely design as well. And I think it should be taught like that in schools as well.
Yeah, and the segregation of all of those things, looking at the historical perspective, is relatively recent too. And so, I mean, you can define design as a kind of umbrella that includes, engineering, that includes all of these things. And it's some of the most creative people I know are engineers, right? And creative problem solvers. You get all those people in a room together, and it's just, there's so much cross-fertilization in the way that they think within their silos that can be, cross-applied. And I think it starts to get really interesting.
So, Gaby, you mentioned the Passive House consultant training. How did you happen on that, and how long ago did you take it, and what was your impetus for taking it?
That's a great question. I think I just kind of knew instinctively that I wanted to do it. I didn't even really understand what it was until I did it. But I did it my first, so I think I was actually working as a facade consultant, and then I kind of decided I needed a break to kind of recalibrate. And actually one of my motivations for that was just being on these job sites of really expensive buildings in New York with pretty expensive facades, and just feeling like the performance was just not there. Like looking at these facades that had, in some cases, holes in them where you could see daylight from one side to the other. Obviously, my role as a consultant was to try to get them to fill those holes. But I just felt like, this culture of performance is not, even in these really high-end, supposedly high-performance projects, it's just not happening. And so I kind of took a step back. I focused a little bit on teaching. And then one of the first things I did was this Passive House training. And it was really eye-opening. Because, I mean, as a building envelope person, it's kind of obvious that it's basically an envelope first, environmental strategy. So, of course, that was really interesting to me, that it really, envelope performance is not optional in Passive House. It's a requirement. And then there's the conversation about how are we going to achieve airtightness, and, is just fundamental to how you practice. And that was really exciting for me, because in all my years of building facades, like the performance of the facade, like the actual performance, how it actually works on site, not just how it works on the drawing, had really never been an important design driver. So yeah, it was pretty mind-blowing for me to see something that was based in fundamentals of building science and also building performance.
Great. Well, I'm excited about your book. I think it will fill a hole in the available information out there as a resource.
We hope so.
Thanks. We hope so too.
This was really, really great. Thank you so much for taking the time and to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
We appreciate it. And we also really appreciate the community that you're building, which we understand this podcast is kind of a part of. I think it's great. And it's kind of unprecedented in the AEC world. And, we're excited to be a part of it.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Mary. Once again, like I said at the outset, I got a lot out of that, even the second and indeed the third time listening to it. Very inspirational stuff. What were some of the highlights for you?
Well, certainly talking about the the detail with which their building science background and talking about the different housing types and the different envelope solutions. But all of that was very exciting, but also their backgrounds and how they got to be where they are today was super interesting for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that combination of watching Dad and getting really hands-on, taking things apart, and also combine that with the interest in history and how the design of buildings in particular influences people and the way cities evolve. I was really intrigued by the idea that there's a lot of, if you look at like terrace housing today, there's a lot that's really similar to 100 years ago or more, 200-300 years ago. If you look back in European design, terrace housing, there are lots of similarities, but there are also some big differences in the technologies and systems used as well. I guess the overarching idea, the concept that they are still working on is this retrofit guide. And that really excites me because it's so important and really, really hard. But that's been a bit of a feature. We've had a bit of discussions about retrofit, Zack, over the year, not just on the podcast, but elsewhere on the accelerator.
Well, definitely, and the magazine that Mary put together for the Passive House Accelerator magazine, the most recent issue dedicated to the topic. I think that a lot of the success of our kind of coverage of retrofit stuff has come thanks to Mary. So nice work, Mary. It's super important, and to me that kind of is connected to what really resonated with me about this interview was this admonition that they have for architects to move beyond this role of aesthetic consultant and to reclaim responsibility for the performance of buildings. And that's really, I mean, that's what retrofits are about. Retrofits often are not flashy, pretty necessarily like, pretty projects that are going to be featured on the cover of a design magazine. Sometimes they are, but often they're not glamorous in that way. But they're so important in terms of creating, slashing greenhouse gas emissions from the buildings and creating havens for people to be safe and be able to breathe clean air and weather crazy heat extremes, all that kind of stuff. So important.
Yeah. Awesome. Great stuff. Anything else from you, Mary?
Well, that's mostly it. I mean, this just following up on what Zack was saying, that there's other kinds of solution providers that could maybe provide retrofit solutions, but really architects are the ones that have the bigger picture. They have the design and hopefully the knowledge of building performance to guide the retrofits that are going to need to happen. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the guide when it comes out, and they hope to bring it out by next year.
Yeah. And I suspect there'll be more to come after that, because I don't imagine that all systems and all solutions for all building types will be able to be summarized in one document. It's such a complex issue that it needs probably regional versions and different typologies. But there are some overarching concepts that people need to think about and could be useful to share.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Hey, well, this been fun, Zack. Thank you for coming up with this idea of going back and reviewing some of our top episodes from our first year of the Passive House podcast. We will be back with some great new content in the weeks to come. We've got some really exciting interviews lined up, which we're very pleased to get stuck into. There's a bunch of other stuff going on as well around the place. Give us a bit of a rundown, Zack.
I will, and I'll make this as concise as possible. I mean, first, I just want to convey how exciting this fall is for the Passive House world, and I've shared that in terms of for the last couple of episodes, sharing what's going on with the conferences by the Passive House Institute, by FIAS, by Passive House Canada, the Passive House Institute New Zealand, and Australian Passive House Association. They all have major events coming up in the next couple of months. At the Accelerator, we also have a pretty unprecedented lineup of programming coming. So one big announcement is that we are launching the Global Passive House Showcase, formerly known as the Global Passive House Happy Hour. So it's at the same time, same Zoom location. Actually, the Zoom link may change, so we'll share information about that. But we'll be unveiling that and doing the first episode of that on September 1st. Once a month, that showcase will include a project from Europe or the UK. And when we do that, we'll actually hold the showcase earlier in the day, so that it works for the presenter and the audiences in the UK and Europe. But we'll communicate clearly about that. So we've got coming up, we have Temporal House, which is a climate refugee housing concept that was featured at the biennial in 2021. This year, we are going to launch Construction Tech on September 7th, the new season, with something we're calling Back to School, which is will be a live show from the BCIT Building Science Lab. We'll have the Pennsylvania Wilds Center, both the design and construction of this Interfit project for this rural sustainable development organization. An exciting Massachusetts affordable housing project is part of this boom of affordable housing that's happening there. A living building in Portland for the PAE engineers' new headquarters, and a ton of other programming. So September is going to be great. October will be exciting. It's really fun to see all this come together. And a big thank you to Sydney Gladu for all of the work that she's doing to coordinate and wrangle this programming together.
Wow, that's quite the list. Thanks for putting that together, Zack, and some exciting changes coming up to the name, but understand the general content and general structure of that weekly session is going to be very similar. And are you still looking for videos of real life buildings that are going up?
Yes, absolutely. If you have a 3-minute walkthrough of a project that you're working on, or a project that you get to live and work in, we're always eager to show those in our programs. Yep.
Yeah, Sean's a master at that, and they don't have to be a full film crew production. Just whip out your phone.
That's right.
Film yourself, or give it to someone else, and walk around the building site. Let us know what you're up to, or a design office. Let us know what you're up to as well. It's always a great to see what's going out in the real world out there. Awesome. Hey, thanks, Mary. Thanks for being here, and thanks again for bringing us some wonderful interviewees this season, and we look forward to more particularly inspiring women that you and Ilka managed to find out there. It's great to have you on the show.
And we've got a great one lined up for the beginning of September. Mackenzie Stickney. It's going to be great.
Yep. And we're going to be talking about climate change a little bit too, because that is very topical. It has been for a while, and it's more and more people are talking about it, but we need to keep it right up there on the agenda and show how we can influence and have a positive impact on that too. So lots of exciting things to come. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you again next week on the Passive House podcast.